you didn't stop loving them. That's the part that makes it so confusing. Because if there was a fight, a betrayal, a clean and obvious reason, this would be easier. You could point to it, name it, move on from it with your conscience intact. But there wasn't. There was just a slow, creeping silence that showed up somewhere between who you used to be and who you're becoming. A distance you didn't create on purpose and don't know how to close. Conversations that used to last until 3 a.m. now run out of things to say before the appetizers arrive. And the thought you've been afraid to finish, I think I've outgrown them. That thought isn't cruel. That thought isn't selfish. That thought is one of the most psychologically significant signals a human being can experience, and almost nobody talks about what it actually means. Today, on Mentra Psychology, we're breaking down the psychology of outgrowing your friends, the experience society calls disloyal, but science calls an unavoidable part of becoming who you were always supposed to be. Stay with me. Let's dismantle the story you've been telling yourself. The one that says outgrowing a friendship means something is wrong with you, that loyalty means staying the same, that real friends last forever, regardless of who you're each becoming in the process. That story isn't just unhelpful, it's psychologically backwards. Outgrowing a friend isn't a failure of love, it's evidence of growth. And growth was never supposed to be convenient for everyone around you. The friendship didn't break because you stopped caring. It shifted because you started becoming. Maybe you've been showing up to the friendship out of history rather than genuine connection. Maybe you've been editing yourself down, your ambitions, your opinions, your excitement about who you're becoming, just to keep the peace in a room that stopped growing with you. Maybe you've been grieving something you can't even explain to the people closest to you. Because how do you tell someone the friendship isn't broken? It just doesn't fit anymore. If any of that sounds familiar, welcome. You're in the right place. Because today on Mentra Psychology, you're about to get something this experience almost never offers. Not judgment, not a how-to guide for cutting people off. Just an explanation, a real one, for something you've been carrying quietly for longer than you should have had to carry it alone. Today on Mentra Psychology, we're breaking down the psychology of outgrowing your friends. Not the surface-level version that tells you to simply find better people. The real psychology, the behavioral science, the deeply human process underneath an experience that millions of people are quietly going through right now, but almost nobody has the language to describe. Because here's what the mainstream conversation about friendship psychology always gets wrong. It treats outgrowing people like a decision, like something you choose. Like one day you wake up, evaluate your circle, and consciously decide to move on. But that's not how outgrowing friends actually works psychologically. It happens beneath the surface, in the gap between who you were and who you're becoming, in the silence between a person who is evolving and a friendship that has stayed exactly the same. Society calls it disloyalty. Therapy culture calls it boundaries. But the psychology of outgrowing your friends is something far more specific and far more inevitable than either of those labels captures. And by the time this video ends, you're going to understand exactly why it's happening, why it had to happen, and why the guilt you've been carrying about it was never yours to hold in the first place. Here's where the psychology of outgrowing friends gets fascinating. Psychologists call it social identity theory. The idea that your sense of self is deeply tied to the groups you belong to. When you grow, your identity shifts. And when your identity shifts, the groups that once reflected who you were start to feel misaligned. And here's the fact that should reframe everything. Research shows the average person completely replaces their friend group every 7 years. Not gradually, completely. Outgrowing friends isn't a personal failure. It's a psychological pattern so universal that science built an entire theory around it.
But social identity theory only explains the pattern. It doesn't explain the pain. Because when you really look at it, outgrowing friends isn't just about identity shifting. It's about what gets left behind. The shared history, the inside jokes, the version of you that only existed inside that specific friendship, and now has nowhere to live. Psychologists call this relational grief. It's the mourning of a relationship that hasn't technically ended, but has fundamentally changed. And what makes this kind of grief so confusing is that the world doesn't recognize it as a real loss. Nobody sends flowers when a friendship quietly fades. But the grief is real. The emptiness is real. And the psychology of outgrowing friends shows us something important, that honoring that grief, instead of rushing past it, is the only way through it. You're not being dramatic. You're experiencing a loss that doesn't have a funeral, and that deserves to be acknowledged. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The discomfort you're feeling right now isn't a sign that something is going wrong. It's a sign that something is going right. There's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. It describes how the most meaningful periods of personal transformation are often preceded by loss, especially the loss of relationships that no longer align with who you're becoming. And here's the truth that tends to shift things for people. Research has shown that when people allow themselves to outgrow relationships that have run their course, they don't end up more alone. They end up more aligned, with higher self-confidence, greater life satisfaction, and deeper, more authentic connections. Because the relationships that come next feel different, more honest, more natural, more you. Outgrowing friends doesn't mean you're destined for loneliness. It means you're making room for the relationships that were built for the version of you that's still becoming. The loss isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a better one. Now, here's where things get distorted. We're taught that real friendships last forever, that loyalty means staying no matter how much you grow, no matter how much things change. And if a friendship ends, someone must have failed. But that narrative was never built around your evolution. It was built around everyone else's comfort. Your growth was never meant to be convenient for the people who preferred the older version of you. But honesty matters here. Not every uncomfortable friendship has been outgrown. Some relationships are worth the conversation. Some are worth the discomfort of growing together instead of apart. So ask yourself honestly, have you tried? Or have you just been quietly disappearing? Because outgrowing someone and avoiding someone are not the same thing. Not psychologically, not emotionally. But if you are someone who is genuinely in that transition, navigating the grief, honoring the history, and still choosing growth anyway, you're not losing people. You're finding alignment. The relationships ahead of you were built for who you're becoming, and that version of you deserves connections that don't require you to shrink just to survive them. Psychologists call it social identity shifting. On Mentra Psychology, we call it the inevitable cost of becoming. You didn't outgrow your friends because you're better. You outgrew them because you refused to stop growing. And that's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to protect. Have you ever outgrown a friendship? Drop it in the comments. This space was built for exactly that conversation. Subscribe. The next video goes deeper. Click it. You'll understand why.